Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley's Climate Commission has issued a report calling for vast reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But will these proposals really curtail global warming or simply burden the economy? We talk with Brad Heavner of Environment Maryland and Bill Cunningham of Unions for Jobs and the Environment. Plus, a new segment, Courting Justice, with law professor Angela Jordan Davis, who today explores with Marc of the Sentencing Project why the U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Choreographer Daniel Phoenix Singh chats about his company's traditional Indian dance forms and how he blends these with his very contemporary dance numbers. Plus, Reuben Jackson reviews guitar legend Eric Clapton's searching memoir. We've got poetry by Grace Cavalieri and ballads by singer-songwriter Joe Jenks. On the Coffee House.
Welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House. Because of its vast Atlantic and Chesapeake shorelines, Maryland is widely viewed one of the most vulnerable states in America to global warming, just from sea level rise and bigger hurricanes alone. It's no surprise then that Governor Martin O'Malley's Special Climate Commission produced bold recommendations in December. Indeed, the 61-page interim report sets a new bar for proposed aggressive action on this issue. The commission, made up of 22 experts and policymakers statewide, calls for a hard target of 25% cumulative greenhouse gas reductions in Maryland by the year 2020 and a 90% reduction by the year 2050. By the way, the latter of those two targets is the boldest ever set by a state. But are these recommendations achievable? What about the risk of higher energy prices and the many businesses who predictably but fiercely say such measures will hurt the state economy? Here to discuss this issue are two people paying close attention to state and national climate policies. Brad Heavner is Director of Environment Maryland, a statewide advocacy nonprofit, and Bill Cunningham, a former staff economist with the AFL-CIO, is President of Unions for Jobs and the Environment, based in Silver Spring, Maryland. Gentlemen, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Brad, let's begin with you. Did Governor O'Malley's panel do a good job with this report in your view?
Well, I think so, certainly. This is just what the doctor ordered. When Governor O'Malley signed the executive order creating this commission, at that point I wasn't sure what to think. I was a bit skeptical. I thought we should have done this policy a year ago, setting a tough cap on Maryland global warming pollution. We had a bill in that didn't get to a vote earlier. And then the governor followed with creating this commission, and I thought, well, maybe this is an excuse for doing nothing. They're going to study the issue to death. But in fact, the opposite has happened. The Maryland Department of the Environment took its job seriously. They looked at the science, and they didn't say, how much might we be able to do? They said, how much do we have to do, and how are we going to do it?
So it's science-based, in other words, and it still is just a report. I mean, there's nothing statutory about this. It recommends a state law. Tell us, what's the next step?
Yeah, there are a few things that the administration can do on their own, but mostly we need to pass legislation, and the biggest one is a statewide cap on global warming pollution, reducing by 25% by 2020, 90% by 2050, establishing timelines to set up all the programs that will get us there, and creating a cap-and-trade system so that companies can find the cheapest ways to do it.
So you cap carbon dioxide and then you trade permits.
That's right.
Bill Cunningham, do you agree that the report hits the right mark?
Yes, I think it's a good report. I think it's a responsible thing for Governor O'Malley to have done. And I think the most important thing about this report is the report identifies many ways to save energy and use energy more efficiently. And I think that's going to be the important key to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Do you agree that Maryland should have a statute like California that says, by law, all industries, all of us together in this state have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage by 2020, for example?
No, I didn't agree with that part. The commission report, one of the recommendations is to base a cap-and-trade program on the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is the California model. So I don't agree with that. I think that's an inappropriate thing to do. I think cap and trade is a very complex and difficult thing to do at the state level. It can be a very inefficient process, and it's really best, that kind of program is best left to the federal government. And there are a number of bills in Congress now, all of them cap and trade programs, and I think that's really where the action should be on cap and trade.
Well, Brad, what do you say to this argument that, you know, this is way too complex for one state to do? Maryland, for example, is really small. Why not wait for national legislation or a change in national government, which could come as early as January 2009? Why should Maryland go to all this trouble?
Well, we are going to get national policy on this. We're going to get international policy on this, too. The question is, how strong is it going to be? We just started the next 3-year process of an international treaty, and that's going to move forward, but it's 3 years away. And anything Congress might do is a couple years away. So everything we can do state by state between now and then will put the momentum towards science-based reductions in global warming pollution so that the state, federal government and international treaties would follow that. And this has already passed equivalent legislation in 3 different states, New Jersey, California, and Hawaii. It's actively being debated in at least half a dozen others, with 2 or 3 of them pretty close to passage. So if we can get to 6, 7, 8 states that do this, the federal government will do a stronger policy.
What do you say to that argument that, you know, it does make sense for states to go ahead and push really hard, because then ultimately you're going to get the strong national legislation that you agree is necessary?
Well, Maryland is already a part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and that is a cap and trade program for electric utilities in Maryland, or electric generators. And that program requires the stabilization of greenhouse gases from those generators and a decline of 10% in their greenhouse gas emissions by 2019. So that program is already in effect. So we have a cap and trade program for that sector, and that's the easiest sector to cap and trade. The rest of the Maryland economy is a very difficult thing to deal with, cap and trade program.
So that's for coal-fired power plants, whereas this comprehensive bill would be for all greenhouse gases generally.
Well, the RGGI program is for all power plants in Maryland, whether they're coal, natural gas, oil, or oil for that matter. So yes, it applies to all electric utilities in Maryland.
So you're saying let's see how that does before we spread the net wider.
Yes, I think it's an experimental program, and it really is based on the fact that it'll raise $100 million a year from the sale of allowances to the generators. And that sale, the first sale, begins in July of this year. And that money then is going to be used for energy conservation and efficiency programs. And the ability to use that money effectively and early will mitigate the impact of higher prices on Maryland consumers. If it's used effectively, then it basically can maintain by incentives for buildings and homeowners, it can effectively protect the budget of the Maryland energy consumer, even if prices go up.
Well, it seems to me we have 2 competing concerns here. One is certainly energy prices. They're going up in Maryland. They're going up all over the United States. We certainly don't want to create a greater burden for consumers of energy, which is all of us. But we also have this issue of extremely rapid climate change. And I know, Brad, you're very concerned about the so-called tipping points.
Well, right, and Bill's right. One of the best things about cap and trade programs is the money that's generated through them that gets used for clean energy purposes is going to have immediate benefits for Maryland and the whole region by investing in small companies that are able to do the energy efficiency retrofits and the renewable energy installation, all this sort of thing, to get us on track. But in addition to that, there are more policies that we need to get on the books, and sooner really matters. We need to get a bunch of strong policies finalized within the next few years to really put us on course. That's what the science says. To catch up with the curve on the science, so we are on track to reducing the pollution by the amount that we need to, and then also get ahead of the curve on the economic development of all this clean energy industry.
Now, Brad, you've made the argument that that these policies to get us off fossil fuels, to reduce our dependence on ever-rising costs of fossil fuels, will actually help consumers in the long term. And you point to California on that.
Well, California uses a lot less energy per person than in Maryland. And the fact is, since we deregulated the electricity system here in 1999, we've invested almost nothing in energy efficiency. So we've fallen behind. That means there are a lot of opportunities out there, and we should start that investment again. We can catch up and reduce our per capita energy consumption.
Bill, do you agree that if implemented correctly, we need not fear these rising energy costs? It actually will be good for consumers.
You mean a cap and trade program or the commission report? I think the energy efficiency and energy conservation programs are what protect Maryland consumers. The cap and trade program is an unknown. We just don't know what effect it's going to have. Already, Marylanders are paying much higher than the national average for their electricity. It was the national average a couple of years ago, but now it's 13.5 cents compared to 10.9% nationally. Maryland consumers are paying a lot more for the natural gas. So we're already paying very high prices for our energy in Maryland. And I think, and there's still some things coming down the pike. The complying with the Healthy Air Act, for example, will cost more for electric
Which
utilities.
was a bill a couple of years ago to clean up power plants in Maryland.
That's
What
right.
about, Bill, what about this issue of very rapid climate change? I mean, the science keeps coming in that it's happening much faster than we thought even 5 years ago. There's one projection that we will be out of summertime ice in the Arctic as early as 2013. Do you think that it's that we need to move as rapidly as the science appears to suggest we have to?
Well, again, we're the unions in UJ are supporting national legislation for cap and trade, and that's the appropriate place to do it. I think there's growing public sentiment for a cap and trade program at the federal level. I just think that the cap and trade program for Maryland, which is 0.3% of the world economy's world emissions of greenhouse gases, isn't going to do anything to change the
what do you say to that, Brad, that this bill won't change one iota global warming internationally?
Well, first off, the amount is significant. Obviously, if it was only Maryland acting and China and the rest of the United States don't act, we still haven't solved the problem. But at this point, I really believe that the Maryland legislature is the exact right decision-making point, and other legislatures in other states similar to Maryland, because right now, that's where the action is. And in a couple of years, that'll bubble up to Congress. A year or two after that, that will go international. But right now is the time for the states to act.
Well, what do you say? I mean, this whole efficiency part, how do we achieve these kinds of efficiencies? What does the commission say is the pathway to getting, the governor's calling for 15% per capita reduction in electricity use in Maryland by the year 2015. Very aggressive. How do we get there?
Well, the commission has reductions all the way from CFL light bulbs and
compact fluorescents
to better conservation in public buildings, putting money into public buildings by the Maryland government to save energy there. Incentives for business, incentives for homeowners to reduce their energy consumption, to insulate their houses, put in better windows, and outreach programs by electric utilities, which we had at one time. We need to bring some of those back in order to reach out to homeowners and buildings to provide those services, to make sure that people know that those services are available.
So this is achievable. I think you both agree that for example, Californians use about half the electricity per capita as Marylanders do as a consequence of 30 years of policies. Brad, what's your prediction? Do you think the Maryland General Assembly is going to turn into law what the Governor's Climate Commission recommends?
Well, it sounds like there is the appetite to work on a big global warming bill this year, and I think the votes would be there to pass something. It's a question of how strong that is. Is it really going to follow the science and do the job?
Bill Cunningham?
Well, we had, we adopted deregulation from California, and that didn't work for us. Energy prices soared as a result. And I think that, the Maryland winters are different, the Maryland summers are different than California.
Both are getting warmer.
And we're a coal-burning state. I mean, we use more than half of our energy from coal, whereas California doesn't have coal burning. Those are very important differences and make a difference in the way we have to approach this issue.
Brad, last couple of seconds, how many other states are looking at this kind of legislation? How many states might do this in 2008?
Massachusetts, Connecticut, Washington State are very close. Other states looking at it are Illinois, Wisconsin's quite close, other New England states, North Carolina.
Well, fantastic. Well, a really big thanks to Brad Heavner and Bill Cunningham for discussing Maryland's bold new climate action plan. If implemented, it will surely create more pressure for similar actions nationwide. But one way or another, big solutions are clearly afoot in the race to solve global warming. I'm Mike Tidwell.
Silver from my mother's mirror gleams its stories toward a light which drops and never breaks. It says to tell the truth, and permanently shining brings forth an original day bright as this one, where children and other small creatures played without threat. But the child's story is never without fear, is it? And seems to be made of remainders which either want for love or some relief from it. In the 3rd grade, the pyramids were presented to us by Miss O'Malley, so kind that she would, in honor of learning, give us the key to Egypt if she could. Who would like to bring dates for all to taste? Who can do this on the lunch hour, she said. Naturally, I, who could not imagine how, said I would. And like a child with enough money to spend, ran home with only 1 hour to ease my dear mother, who probably had little money in the house, yet who bravely said, "Shouldn't you buy 2 packages for the class?" I said, "No." Love and fear divided in my mind between an ocean of children and my mother's troubled face. "1 package is all I need," I lied. "Someone else will bring the rest." Children spend so much time persuading, no wonder no one believes them. 8 dates for 20 children, which would taste so sweet. Miss O'Malley, always kind, cut the tiny squares, and I kept interrupting, hoping they wouldn't notice. After all, there wasn't water in the land of pyramids, was there? And not too many trees. Probably hungry people and small rations there as well. That day, every one of us was a reflection of the other. The children who ate their portions, the mother at home worrying about her daughter's gift, the child thinking about her mother's face, and Miss O'Malley, kind and earnest, taught us all about a hardy people in an arid land who gave what they had and could give nothing more.
Welcome to Courting Justice at the Coffee House. The United States incarcerates over 2 million people in its prisons and jails and has the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher than Russia and significantly higher than France, England, Canada, or Japan. The United States also incarcerates African Americans and Latinos at much higher rates than whites. Why does this country lock up so many of its residents and citizens? And why are there such stark racial disparities in our criminal justice system? To shed light on these complex issues is Marc, the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, a national research and advocacy organization that works to promote sentencing reform and alternatives to incarceration. Welcome, Marc, to the Coffee House.
Thanks, good to be here.
So, Marc, why does this country lock up so many people, and why do we have the highest incarceration rate in the world? Do we have people in our country who are more prone to criminal activity than other countries?
Well, some people think that, we must have 7 times as much crime as other industrialized nations to explain this 7 times greater disparity in incarceration. When it comes to violent crime, we do have a higher rate than many other industrialized countries, particularly violent crimes committed with firearms. We're the only major industrialized nation that doesn't have any significant gun control. That explains part of the difference. But when it comes to property crimes, drug crimes, and the like, there's no significant difference. The chances of being burglarized in New York, London, Paris are roughly the same. Much of what we're looking at is that we've had this so-called Get Tough movement for more than 3 decades now, and that we have chosen to respond to crime in a very punitive way. Rather than trying to deal with causes of crime, we focus much more harshly on the consequences, primarily through get tough sentencing policies.
Well, you mentioned that there are more violent crimes here. Most of the people that are incarcerated in our prisons and jails, people who've committed violent offenses?
Well, no. About half the people in prison are there for violent offense, but half of them are there for nonviolent property or drug crime, often serving many years in prison, very long periods of time. People have committed a crime, yes, but because of the lack of other alternatives, they get sentenced to prison, and again, much longer than other comparable nations.
Well, has this high incarceration rate in this country had a significant effect on the crime rate, for example, in our cities?
Well, you know, the crime rate has been declining generally since the early 1990s. There's a lot of politicians and others who think that since the incarceration rate has been rising, crime rate's been going down, this must be the connection. But this is a very short-sighted approach. Back in the 1980s, the prison population was rising, and yet crime was also rising. The best research to date tells us that since the 1990s, incarceration had maybe 25% of the impact for reducing crime, which also tells us that 3/4 of the decline in crime had nothing to do with incarceration, had to do with changes in the drug trade, changes in community policing, changes in the economy. So incarceration as a strategy for reducing crime, I think is very short-sighted, much more limited than many people might believe.
Well, you know, people are concerned about public safety. I mean, what would you say to people who have those concerns? That's probably one of the biggest concerns of people in our country, is to be safe in their homes and their neighborhoods. If you say that alternatives to incarceration is a good idea, would that have an effect on public safety if we moved more towards alternatives to incarceration?
Well, of course, we're all concerned about public safety. I've been a victim of crime. Everybody we know has been a victim or knows people have been victimized by crime. So the question is not whether we care about public safety, what can we do? Now, when we sentence somebody to prison, it costs about $25,000 a year to keep that person locked up. So if that person is a serial rapist, nobody's going to worry about the money too much. If that person is a low-level drug seller who's selling drugs in order to support his own drug addiction, then it becomes a very different question. We know that for a lot less than $25,000 a year, we can provide very high-quality drug treatment in a community setting. When we use prison, basically we're spending $25,000 a year to keep a person locked in a prison cell. We don't do anything about that drug addiction. We don't do anything about the lack of job skills, educational achievement that so many prisoners face. It's not a very good use of funds if we're trying to affect public safety.
Well, you mentioned drugs. There's been a lot in the news lately about the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. And in fact, the Supreme Court has recently spoken on that issue. Can you explain, first of all, what is that disparity between powder and crack cocaine in terms of the sentencing laws, and why is there a disparity in the sentencing laws?
Well, the disparity goes back to the mid-1980s. Crack cocaine was making its emergence as a new and very dangerous drug. Crack is a bad drug, so was powder cocaine, so was heroin and many other drugs. What happened was that Congress, in a rush to pass some laws to deal with this new problem of crack cocaine, in virtually record time, without any hearings, without consulting any experts, set the thresholds for crack cocaine and powder cocaine at very different levels. For powder cocaine, under federal law, if you sell 500 grams, about a pound, you get a mandatory 5 years in prison. For crack cocaine, all it takes is 5 grams, the weight of a sugar packet essentially, to get that same mandatory 5 years in prison. So we have this so-called 100-to-1 ratio in the quantity of drugs that you get the mandatory sentence. Congress passed these laws, said let's get tough on this drug. This is the answer to the problem. One of the many consequences of these policies has been enormous racial disparities. More than 80% of the people prosecuted for crack offenses have been African American. For powder cocaine, it's far more likely to be whites or Latinos. So we have this very punitive law with a very strong racial dynamic. Many people believe could have been predicted in advance, but we see the results today.
So do you think that Congress knew about the racial disparity? I mean, my question was, why did they create the disparity in the first place?
Well, I think the image at the time, in the mid-1980s, of the crack user seller was that of a young black man. Whether or not that was correct, the cover of Newsweek magazine, lots of TV coverage and things, talked about this new urban drug, and the code word essentially was for a young black male. I think what we've seen the whole history of drug policy for 100 years now is that race and drug policy are intimately linked, and the sort of image of the drug user very much determines what things look like. Back in the 1930s, marijuana was viewed as a drug that was used by blacks in nightclubs and by Mexicans in the racy parts of town. Along came the 1960s, white males, white females started using marijuana in great numbers, and all of a sudden societal attitudes changed almost overnight. So nothing had changed about the drug. It was just the perception of the user.
But is that perception true? I mean, isn't it true that whites also use crack cocaine? And haven't there been studies done by the Sentencing Commission that have shown that, in fact, more whites use crack cocaine than African Americans, even though African Americans are prosecuted more for
precisely.
Those drugs?
So, it doesn't reflect at all who's using the drugs. What it does reflect is law enforcement practices. Basically, we know that drug use and drug abuse cuts across lines of race and class, but drug law enforcement primarily is located in low-income communities of color. So when we talk about the war on drugs, it's really a two-tiered war on drugs. For middle-income communities, when they have drug problems, they deal with a public health approach. They use treatment programs. In low-income communities, we don't have those same resources available, and so it becomes a criminal justice problem.
Well, let's talk a bit about the racial disparities that I spoke of earlier. There are these tremendous racial disparities in our criminal justice system. I know that you authored a report years ago and then updated it, now showing that something like 1 in 3 African Americans are under the control of the criminal justice system. Can you shed a little light on what the cause or some of the causes of those disparities are?
Well, it's a complicated story, of course. I mean, some of that relates to higher rates of crime in some minority communities, but what looks like a racial effect is really one of class for the most part. We're talking about poverty, concentrated poverty, and the disadvantages that go along with that. In part, that translates into some rates of crime issues, but mostly it has to do with socioeconomic circumstances of those communities, the failure to invest in developing community institutions and developing job prospects means that the criminal justice system has sort of taken over and become the institution of choice by which policymakers have addressed these problems.
But isn't there some disparate treatment also of African Americans and Latinos in our criminal justice system by officials in our system? We hear talk of racial profiling all the time. I mean, isn't that also a possible cause?
Well, certainly it is. And, there's some people say, well, the Jim Crow era is over. And yes, it is true that, you'd be hard-pressed to go in a courtroom today and hear overtly racist language in most places. But by a whole host of decisions, racial profiling by law enforcement, inadequate indigent defense, where some people come to court barely have an attorney representing them, the lack of options as alternatives to incarceration for low-income people. At each step along the way, people of color, low-income people are disadvantaged in the court system that's supposed to be neutral, but in fact has a strong bias built into it.
What do you see as some of the most, I guess, pressing issues in our criminal justice system now in terms of reform, some of the issues you're working on, for example?
Well, certainly one of the most critical ones is the whole mandatory sentencing movement of the last 20 years. Mandatory sentencing means that judges have no discretion. They can't make a distinction between somebody who's flying in drugs by the plane load and a kid on the street corner who's selling drugs because he's addicted or so. And judges are judges because they're supposed to be making those decisions, and yet legislative bodies have taken that away. So what we need to do is certainly re-examine, I would hope repeal mandatory sentencing laws. There's no shortage of prison cells for people who are true drug kingpins and need to be in prison, but we don't need to be filling prisons with low-level drug offenders. Secondly, I think we just need to invest much more in the front end through prevention and treatment approaches, which have been demonstrated to be much more effective than incarceration, as we need to shift the balance that's been so out of line for more than 30 years now.
Any movement along those lines in Congress or in any of our state legislatures?
Well, we're encouraged. I think there is a shift that's beginning to take place. In Congress, legislation around prisoner reentry, basically easing the transition back to the community through reentry programs. What's interesting about it is that the political alignment that's come together. On the House, the movement is primarily led by leaders in the Congressional Black Caucus. In the Senate, the key sponsor is Senator Brownback of Kansas, one of the most conservative people in the legislature, certainly. And yet he, from his faith-based approach to problems, his belief in forgiveness and redemption, is a very strong proponent of these laws. So I think we're starting to see a shift in the political climate that may provide some openings in the coming years.
Well, yeah, the racial disparities issue is certainly one that is a stark one, and as well as all of these other issues. And it's an issue that I'm sure will a long fight, and we appreciate all the work that you've done on this over the years.
We're working at it, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Marc Maurer, for your important insights. And to learn more about these issues, visit the Sentencing Project's website at www.sentencingproject.org. I'm Angela Jordan Davis, and this has been Courting Justice.
After years of spinning dazzling blues-drenched tales on the electric guitar, the great Eric Clapton has decided to pen his memoirs. The results, entitled Clapton, are as entrancing and emotionally forthright as the British-born Axeman's most memorable recordings. But don't worry, we aren't talking tabloid-inspired confessions. Clapton's 328 pages, which cover his bittersweet childhood, rapid ascendancy in the fertile British music scene of the 1960s, countless affairs, and his struggles with alcohol and heroin, allow the stories to tell themselves. He doesn't beg for our pity, nor does he attempt to sidestep his shortcomings. Clapton tells us that, quote, bad life choices were his specialty, a far cry from his consistently tasteful musicianship. And believe me, this memoir is crowded with them. Still, you find yourself pulling for the musician ironically nicknamed Slow Hand, and not just because he is a great musician. The author's eventual reconciliation with his past, coupled with his hard proverbial look in the mirror, will resonate with longtime fans and with readers who never heard Cream, Blind Faith, or any of Clapton's other musical projects. In fact, one could argue that the personal triumph chronicled in the book's pages is Clapton's greatest solo. But fear not, music lovers. The book doesn't give short shrift to the aforementioned collaborations. One can almost feel the author's hands sprinting up and down the fretboard, crafting his own variations on the blues. I'm Reuben Jackson, and this has been Writer's Block.
Brought you two roses in the summer sunshine, fresh as the morning and the color of wine, seeking a song I did not understand. You just smiled at me gently and reached for my hand and said, we've touched a beauty that only love knows. You want to hold on to so fine, but the sweetest of roses is the one that still grows on the vine, on the vine, on the vine. Jealousy sounds in my heart even still, like the thunder that rolls down this West Texas hill. But the rainbow appears, and it's then I recall, love is so big, there's enough for us all. We've touched a beauty that only love knows. We want to hold on to a feeling so fine, but the sweetest of roses is the one that still grows on the vine, on the vine, on the vine. We met here as strangers, we leave now as friends. God grant the love that we share never ends. May it guard us and guide us and show us the way. May it be our companion and grace every day. For we've touched a beauty that only love knows. We want to hold on to a feeling so fine, but the sweetest of roses, the one that still grows on the vine, on the vine, on the vine. Yes, the sweetest of roses, the one that still grows on the vine, on the vine, on the vine. And the sweetest of love is the one that takes time. And the sweetest of roses, the one on the vine.
Well, welcome to the Coffee House, Joe Jenks.
Thank you, David.
It's a pleasure.
My pleasure.
I've heard you and produced you in concert in the past, and this is some new ground here. This is some new topic here.
Yeah, cutting some new turf for
Give me a little insight to...
Well, my oldest brother passed away 4 years ago, and I quit writing entirely when he passed away. And about 2 years after that, I began writing again. And what I was writing really came from the same heart space that my other songs come from, but the message was coming out in a way that was a little more universal.
Yeah.
You know, I was writing personal songs in a way that translated to a broader audience and allowed a much broader audience to sort of personally identify with that story.
I think that's the key to good songwriting, because when people go home and they hear the song and they go, you know, how did he know that happened to me? Or that's exactly the same feeling that I had, and I couldn't express it that way. That's when you're really connecting with the audience.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, it feels good. You know, it's. I think any musician really is a multifaceted stone, and it's important to keep cutting new facets on that stone and not get stuck in a rut.
The name of the first song you played was
"The Sweetest of Rose."
Okay.
And I just wrote that coming back from the Kerrville Folk Festival.
About someone in particular, or we'll just keep them guessing?
Well, you know, I think it's really just about that sort of, I don't know, those of you that go to folk festivals will know what I'm talking about, but you get in that space after a few days and your heart just gets so much bigger and you're just sort of in love with everybody.
And then when you leave, it's like, oh, darn, I got to go back to the real world.
That was sort of my transition song from that great, big, huge love place of a good festival back to the rest of the world.
And that's coming up on the new album.
Yeah, that's coming out on the new album this year.
What is the title of the album?
The title of the album is The Candle and the Flame.
Okay. And how about the next song you're going to do? Is that also part of that album?
Yeah, it's a song called Come With Me, and is it live?
And this is another thing that musicians can do. You can be talking about one thing and tuning at the same time, and that you do that without thinking about it, you know. But that's really multitasking at its peak. You know, you're like one space talking to the guy doing the interview while you're tuning, and it's amazing.
It works. Yeah. So I nearly drowned in the Klamath River 2 years ago up in Northern California. I was on a retreat with Peter Alsop, a great children's musician, and Holly Near, who some of the viewers may know. And I started off the retreat sort of with a bang. I nearly drowned myself in the Klamath River. And I had a sense of myself as being a strong swimmer that was about 10 years out of date.
Right.
And I got myself into trouble.
Yeah.
And luckily there was someone there to help me. This woman, Jax, was out in the river with me right away. And she told me to put my hands on her shoulders and told me to take a deep breath. And I did, and then another, and finally, you know, she saw the color come back to my face and the panic leave my eyes, and she says, "Okay, let's keep swimming." And I thought, wait a minute.
That's a philosophy, yes.
You're here to save me. What's this, you know?
Yeah.
And I realized, you know, that this is me running through my whole life. This is me looking for
let's
people
keep swimming,
to save me from the struggles and failing to recognize the good people that are there beside me all the time, just encouraging me and helping me move forward. And you know, I think we all have those people in our lives, those people that remind us to let go of the panic and take a deep breath and keep swimming.
All right, well, keep singing, too.
Yeah.
I'll see you in a bit.
All right, thanks, Steve.
summon up my strength once more. I am weary on this journey, afraid I will not reach that distant shore. I cry for help, feel like I'm sinking. There is no one near me I can see, but there you are in the water with me. Take my hand and guide me graciously. Will you come with me on this journey? Every breath we take, keep reaching for the dawn. I know, Lord, that I will falter. With a good friend near me, I will carry on. There is a kindness in your smile and a gentleness within your speech. You reassure me, your love surrounds me, that oh, safety is at last within my reach. Will you come with me on this journey? Every breath we take, keep reaching for the dawn. I know, Lord, that I will falter. With a good friend near me, I will carry on. It's an illusion we carry with us as we wade on through the waters of our lives. That we must be strong and hold our own here, but a helping hand will save us by and by. Will you come with me on this journey? Every breath we take, keep reaching for the dawn. I know, Lord, that I will falter. With a good friend near me, I will carry on. I know, Lord, that I will falter. With a good friend near me, I will carry on. With a good friend near me, I will carry on.
Welcome to In Step at the Coffee House. When two elements are present, we as observers often are led to comparison. And when there are three elements present, we have the opportunity to compare and often are led to adaptation. An entity, in this case, a pioneering approach to dance language and content, can be enhanced by the comparison of two other things: the classical East Indian forms of dance and a contemporary American sensibility have been combined by our next guest, the artistic director of Dakshina Phoenix Dance Theater, Daniel Singh, and he creates an entirely new form. We welcome Daniel and his work to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
It's great. It's great to have you here. You know, we see each other in passing at the World That Is Dance in Washington, right? Our own little mini version of the Golden Globes.
Yes.
And but we don't have a chance to sit down and talk too much. And I think that's probably true of a lot of us in the dance world. We're so busy running around doing what it is that we do. So it is really great to have this time with you. I found out some things recently about you that I'm going to mirror back to you, and you know, I have all my assumptions. I see your beautiful promotion work. I see the emails that come across my screen, and I'm assuming that you've been dancing since you were a child and melting forms since way back when. But you're here to prove me wrong, right? So tell me a little bit about how you started dancing and why, and we'll go from there.
I started dancing pretty late in life. I started dancing in college. I was a computer science major, almost done with my computer science degree, and I had to take a few physical education requirements, and I took a ballet class with Pamela Matthews, a local dancer, and it changed my life, and I loved it a lot, and decided I was going to stay and finish a dance degree as well, and I was at UMBC. Right. So I started there, and then took a little break after my undergraduate degree, and then went over to College Park and did my master's there. And here I am.
And here you are. And the study in these programs, for folks who don't know, is more focused on contemporary American modern dance or contemporary forms, I guess.
Yes,
right?
Both the programs were mostly in modern dance. Right. And while I was doing that, I was also working with a local teacher in Indian dance, classical dance.
Right, and that's your family's heritage is East Indian, yes. And a long line of non-dancers.
A long line of non-artists of any sort.
Right, right, yes. and you know, it's a little like a needle in a haystack. You know, how do you find this after you know, not being groomed this way? You know, we see it in our own children of Hollywood. You know, they're all groomed to be actors or dancers or singers and all that. And how do you become this one in a million?
I think a lot of it had to do with the teachers I had. They approached dance, and they were able to talk about it in terms of physics, in terms of kinetics, in terms of movement and space and architecturally. And so I think for me, coming from a computer science background of logic and math and all those things, they were very easily able to translate those experiences into this new experience for me. Yeah. And so that helped me to find a way into this new language and take it from there.
And it sounds like it appealed to your intellect as well as the physicality of it and that. So, and your own, I mean, can we start with the East Indian world? I mean, I feel like the study of that, you know, why that? You could have ignored all that. Why did you go back to that?
It was something I had probably had some subconscious interest in. I grew up in the dance capital of India. It's called Chennai, and they have the best dance festivals in the world. And I'm sure I saw it, and it filtered into my consciousness at some point and some level. And so I definitely felt a calling to go back and explore it some more and see what this culture and heritage was about.
So simultaneously, you're doing that and discovering at least American modern dance is well, they say it's a little over 100 years old, give or take a decade or two. You know, do they compare at all? How are they the same and how are they different?
I think in classical Indian dance, it's a very composite model. They work with the music and theater and literature and myths from the Indian culture, and it's a very community-based experience. Anyone coming to a performance usually knows the stories that are going to be told. They're looking for a new interpretation from you. How do you take what's already done and do a new version of that? So it's a more daunting process in that sense, because most of the people in the audience are aware of the stories and histories, and here you are up there trying to find a new voice in that. So that has that approach to it. And it has a very strong use of gesture and lots of rhythm, which is a very integral part of Indian dance. And in modern dance, I found it gave me the space to kind of balance all that interpretation and guided structure. Modern dance gave me the space, improvisation, and it gave me a place to be abstract. So that was what I found very attractive about modern dance and helped me kind of balance the two worlds a little bit.
And in your work right now, do they live in separate entities? Is this a modern piece and is this an East Indian piece, or do they mix up a little bit, or what?
I think I do all three. I do purely classical Indian dance. We work with choreographers from India and dancers from India who help us hold on to that traditional part of our company. And then I do purely modern works, and then we do some that are a fusion of the two. So we're all over the place.
And you've also in the last 5 years, you've presented artists from India and from the States as well, Canada, here in D.C. So that's a lot to work on at the same time while you're trying to choreograph and dance yourself. How has that road been?
I think part of it also was, again, based on my whole influence by the Indian dance, where dance is this complex beast. You don't just have one easy way to look at things. So when I started working my own dance company, I also wanted to present others I found interesting or motivating in some way. And so I decided to find as many companies I thought I could work with or present, and as a way of helping us grow as well.
And that seems, I hope it's paid off that audiences have followed this, followed you and the other companies as well.
So our festival's grown. It's going to be a 5th year this year, and we're growing each year, and we're bringing bigger and better artists each year. So it's been a wonderful experience.
So when we come to see you in one of the many theaters that I know, a range of theaters from smaller houses like Dance Place to the Tivoli Gila Hispanic Theater space, as well as Lincoln Theater. I mean, these are all very different kinds of spaces to be presenting work.
Yes.
Is that challenging for you as a performer or choreographer, or?
It's challenging in a good way. I think as a dancer, you have to learn how to work in a small, tight space, and then when you have the freedom of a bigger space, it helps you use the space differently. And with Indian dance especially, it works well in tight places because it's a very intimate dance form, but then you're able to find a way to work in group choreography, which is a new concept in Indian dance when we come onto a bigger stage like Lincoln. So it gives us ways to modify what we know and grow on that.
And when you say that it's a new concept, group dances, can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Most Indian dance forms are solo dance forms. It was done in either temples or palaces, and so you dance for the king or you dance for the gods, and so it was usually one person performing the dance form. And very recently, choreographers in India and abroad have been working on group choreography, dynamics, and use of space in a different way. So
that's fascinating. And so I can imagine then that if it's been this one person, that to multiply that one image by 10 or 15 or 20 is a new thing, which is great, but also it's not offering you a group dynamic or a sense of the craft of choreography when you're dealing with a group.
Yes.
And do you find with the American sensibility or a modern sensibility, it seems to be that there are soloists in that world, but it seems to be more a group thing, right?
Yes, I find that modern dance is more a group experience, and since it's abstract, there's only so many solo abstract works you can do, or I shouldn't generalize and say it's abstract, but so I find that the modern dance helps with the group choreography and group setting in that sense.
And I know from your background, I know one of the works that you made, and I believe the audience are going to see a clip of, is that you made a piece that takes place in a nightclub, or that is the ultimate group, and it also seems the ultimate situation for our youth in these days, that the group social dance aspect of it all, and why that piece when you made it, and why do you keep it in your repertoire?
I was trying to find a way to create a composite production, like I had an experience with my Indian dance using popular dance forms. I'm very much into salsa dance, and I go to Club Chaos every week, and so I was trying to figure out a way to blend what I was doing outside the studio in my fun time, and then to work in my academic background, and so I thought of doing it in a nightclub setting. And so the studios that we stood in was a wonderful place to set it up as a nightclub, and that's how it started.
That's great. That's wonderful. And it doesn't sound like you have a lot of free time. I mean, I rarely see you out and about on the street or that kind of thing. But you have a life you have a 9-to-5 job in addition to your dance world, and how does your personal life intersect the professional lives that you have? How does that all happen?
I do a lot of yoga, and it helps me balance everything out. But I think it's just getting my priorities in order, and for me right now the priority is to dance as much as I can and put my work out as much as I can. So everything else kind of orders itself after that and helps me keep focused going forward.
Sure.
And also knowing when to say no and say, okay, this is enough for now, and maybe next year we'll try something different.
Right. And now you've just returned from a trip from India.
Yes.
And I don't know how much you remember. How old were you when you left?
I was 17.
You were 17, so you were certainly aware of life.
Yes.
How have things changed in the last few years? You come back now as an artist, and that's different than when you left. How do you see it differently, or how has it changed, do you think?
India?
In India, yeah.
There's a much bigger dance scene in India. People have definitely been discovered, so to speak, with all the international festivals that have been picking choreographers, and somehow the international validation has given them a little more space in their own country,
Right.
so to speak. And so they've definitely gotten a lot more validation, and the art scene has picked up a
Right.
lot more. And the younger choreographers are also being exposed to a lot more.
Right.
That they're now that there's TV and internet and YouTube and all these other things, they're able
Right.
to see and experience dance forms which even 10 years ago they wouldn't have had the
Right.
access to. So I think it's changing the way they choreograph and they
Right.
experiment, and I think it's going to be a rich, wonderful experience. I can't wait to see what's going to
That's
come out
great.
of there.
And how do you feel, I mean, there's a younger generation all over the world, I think, has
Yes.
been influenced by the internet and by what you can see on YouTube and,
Yes.
and look at that move and see this dance. How will people 25 years from now remember you and your company and your work? What do you hope they remember, or how will you stay in their minds all that time?
I think what's most important to me is to be able to give people a way to find their own voice. And I think for me, it's been the voice of an immigrant trying to hold on to their culture and then trying to find this new land that I've adopted.
Right.
And I think there are more and more immigrants, and they're taking an active voice in the community. And I think I want to be able to give them a place and a space to see themselves, and also maybe encourage them to be the next generation of artists.
That's great. That's great. And it strikes me that your audiences, they'll find a way to come into your world and connect with you. If you were to ask them one question, what would it be when they enter the door? Yeah.
I would tell them to come in and say, what was the first experience before you knew words? What did you remember?
That's great.
I
think that's a really great place to. We've begun our conversation, and now we're going to finish our conversation just when I feel like we could find out more. Many thanks to you. Thank you so much, Daniel, and for sharing this world of yours. And I hope that we can all join him and his company and international guests soon in one of our area theaters. I'm Peter DeMuro, and this has been In Step. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we talk.